Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another installment of our Wednesday evening events. Thank you all for being with us. Tonight, we'll be discussing the psychology of stickiness, what the U.S. can learn from its annexation of the Philippines in 1898. Our speaker here tonight is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Strategic Studies at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He received his PhD in public policy from Harvard University, where he studied American foreign policy and presidential decision-making in William McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt administrations. He has hosted several podcasts, including Snack Break, the Belfer Center's foreign policy podcast at the Harvard Kennedy School called Office Hours, and another podcast for the NGO Sense and Sustainability. He published a book on education and diplomacy in 2016 and has published a foreign policy opinion pieces in War on the Rocks, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, the Yale Journal of International Affairs, The New Republic. His academic research has been published by Negotiation Journal and the Journal of Applied History. So thank you so much. Aroop, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much, John. I'm going to share my screen soon. And all right. It's all appearing okay for you, John?
Yes,
Great.
Everything looks good.
Awesome. All right. So thank you so much for having me. Thanks to the John Quincy Adams Society and folks who are doing this now and also folks who are viewing it later. My name is Aroop Mukharji. I'm a postdoctoral fellow and now a visiting scholar at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, as John mentioned. And I also am an associate at the Applied History Project at the Kennedy School, and now, as of this week, a non-resident fellow at the Eurasia Group Foundation. So I'm excited to be here talking about. This is basically something that came out of my PhD thesis, as John had kindly mentioned. I'd written about both the McKinley and the Roosevelt administrations, and I want to talk to you all today about William McKinley, who was our nation's 25th president. His decision to annex the Philippines in 1898. This was a very, very major decision. And for those of you who've either is aware of of all the details of that decision or need some brushing up, don't worry. We will go through all the necessary background. But I think it's a decision that's not just very, very significant, very consequential for U.S. power in Asia and actually U.S. power in general, the arc of U.S. foreign policy over the last 120 years. It also, I think, teaches us something about a perennial issue in American foreign policy. And so that's actually kind of where I want to start, is a question. Why, let's see. Oops. Yep. Why is it so hard to let go? I think it's something that we see a lot in American foreign policy. I'm not the first to point this out. It's hardly original that the U.S. is quite involved militarily around the world. It has installations, it has active duty personnel. But I think what's interesting is that, I'm sure there are even more than this. I just only went back so far as Clinton, W. Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden, all coming into office, had sort of criticized previous interventions as distractions, and had sort of said we need to refocus where we put our military force, many of them promising some kind of rollback. And yet it is very, very difficult to do so. And I should say this next graph doesn't actually include Biden's drawdown of Afghanistan. I think this actually doesn't apply to the Biden administration. But certainly you can see from the early 1990s to 2020, while there was a drawdown in Europe, troop levels basically are where they were in the early 1990s. And of course, there was a spike in the Middle East, as you can see in the mid-aughts and early 2010s. But the overall numerical deployment is basically the same. And that's sort of curious to me, given that all these presidents, and I think they mean it genuinely, that they do kind of want that, and do think of the world. Nevertheless, it's very, very hard for them to do so. So I want to spend time thinking about a decision that a president made in 1898, even though it's 120 years ago. I think actually it holds a lot of important takeaways for how we think about the world today, despite living in a very, very different world. So I sort of call this concept, I draw from an actually established concept in economics and decision science called the endowment effect, and we'll talk about the endowment effect. I'm sort of loosely calling it a psychology of stickiness, a kind of stickiness of military footprint abroad that I think undergirds U.S. presence, that inflates our sense of risk. When you have lots of installations of personnel abroad, you sort of think about risks very differently than if those folks were not there. I think a good example of this is, as I had mentioned, Biden's decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. That is a great example. It took 20 years. The U.S. actually supported a drawdown a decade ago, but yet it still took another 10 years. And while I sort of understand the point that there are risks in the world, to me, and the U.S. can't, of course, to me, the U.S. can't always minimize those to zero. I find it very hard to believe that, in 100 years, historians will look back and say, the United States really should have stayed another decade there, or they should have really stayed another 2 decades there. And yet it was actually still very controversial and still very difficult for Biden to make that decision, which I thought was the right decision. So I think we sort of see this in a lot of ways. There are many other cases, of course, of the U.S. staying in an area longer than it should. And many people have made that point. But to me, there's this sort of general stickiness that is the case. I don't think it's a single example. It's not just the Middle East. I think it actually happens everywhere to some degree. The biggest foreign policy question of our day is the U.S. relationship with China, U.S. presence in Asia. Of course, Russia tragically was now back in the forefront of U.S. foreign policy making at the moment. Nevertheless, I sort of think still the larger strategic question going forward will be China. That may change, but I would say that's still the case today, despite other major issues sort of popping up on the agenda. And I think what's interesting about McKinley's decision in 1898 is actually that it sort of led to U.S. major power status in Asia. In 1898 in general and in Asia, most people think of, or many people I talk to think of World War II as being the moment that the U.S. really got involved in Asia. And of course, it was a huge moment that the U.S. Got involved in Asia. But actually, that's not when it started. It started in 1898 when the U.S. annexed the Philippines, which was a country of 9 million people, the size of Arizona. Quite a bit of ways away from the United States. And I think the main lesson from this annexation, which of course we'll talk about very soon, is that I think that there's a everyday psychological bias, as I mentioned, it's called the endowment effect, and we'll talk about it more, that has the ability to try to transform areas of minor value into central national interests. It doesn't always lead to decades of foreign entanglement, but I think there's that risk. It certainly inflates our strategic valuation of certain areas of the world. So that's what we're going to talk about today. This is the man I spent many years studying, William McKinley, the nation's 25th America. Everyone may be American, but the United States' 25th president. He, on October 28th, 1898, this is probably, in my opinion, this has got to be one of the top few days of significance in U.S. history with respect to relations with East Asia, because on this day, Following the Spanish-American War, the War of 1898, which will sort of get into the background of why McKinley was in a position to annex the Philippines, but Spain had been the colonial ruler of the Philippines for quite some time. The U.S. went to war with Spain, defeated Spain very quickly, and then annexed the Philippines. And October 28th was the day that McKinley sent the cable. There was a peace treaty going on in Paris. He was sitting in Washington, D.C., and he sent a cable telling his peace commissioners, okay, I've made my decision. I want you to annex all of the Philippines. I want you to demand all of the Philippines from the Spanish. So that is why this day is so important and significant in U.S. history. I know there's a lot of, some people bristle at the use of the word U.S. imperialism, and there's a lot of ways to use that phrase. There's a huge subliterature in history on informal imperialism, which among other things includes economic control. What we're talking about right now is not informal, it's very, very formal imperialism. This was an annexation of another country, a colonization of another country for 45 years. It started, of course, in 1898, lasted until the 1940s when the Japanese had actually attacked the Philippines the same day as Pearl Harbor, as they attacked Pearl Harbor, taking over a huge chunk. They attacked U.S. forces in the Philippines. After their defeat, of course, the Philippines then soon got independence. But for the first half of the 20th century, they were under U.S. colonial rule. And it is not, a small distance between the United States and the Philippines. I want to this map just really help to kind of understand the scope of what we're talking about. This was a huge, huge decision. As I said, I think it's one of the most significant policies the U.S. has ever had with respect to East Asia. I mean, it is what that annexation is what led the U.S. to become a regional power in Asia. It was during the Spanish-American War, actually, that the U.S. also annexed Hawaii. You sort of see that in the middle of the screen. But I mean, the Philippines is a big country. It's the size of, as I said, Arizona in area, 2,000 islands. It had 9 million people living there at the time of annexation. And the U.S., to maintain this control, had to build up its military. Its military until this time was actually quite small because of the Spanish-American War, which required a huge mobilization. After annexing the Philippines, to maintain this imperial control, the U.S. had to then actually sustain a larger military. So this was just a really, really major moment in U.S. history. And I should say, it's not that people have never thought about it. This is also one of the most studied moments. I don't know if it's as in vogue as it was several decades ago, but the War of 1898 and U.S. Control of the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, Cuba, Hawaii is a huge, huge literature in history, has a huge literature in history. To give a sense of the Spanish-American War, so sort of taking a step back, what led McKinley to be in this position to annex the Philippines was the fact that the United States was at war with Spain. Now, Spain, as you can see, and I haven't highlighted all of Spanish territories, these were actually territories that had been mentioned or important within the War of 1898, but Spain also held, bits of Africa, Western Sahara there, sort of southern part of Morocco. That was Spanish territory. Spain and France sort of trading those some territories in that western part of Africa. But with respect to the War of 1898, you can see the United States sitting there. Okay, now we're at war, which, by the way, I should say was because of Spanish. Probably one of the biggest reasons. Certainly catalyst was Spanish oppression of Cubans. Basically, the Spanish who held Cuba had set up basically concentration camps or camps of where there was rife with starvation and disease, and also massacred revolutionaries. And so basically from the mid 1890s until the U.S. declared war, Spain was violently suppressing Cuban revolutionaries. And that was the impetus for the U.S. to declare war. But once it declared war on Cuba, of course, you have to take into account all of Spanish territories where their fleet is, what they can attack. And so there were these, some older war plans, a couple years before McKinley came to office that sort of said something like, look, the Philippines is where the Spanish keeps its Pacific fleet. You should attack that, partly to neutralize any threat to the West Coast, despite how far away it is, but also really to use it as a bargaining chip in future peace negotiations. So very early on, in fact, the first battle of the War of 1898 between Spain and the United States, which also included, I should say, Cuban revolutionaries and Filipino revolutionaries, actually took place in Manila, the capital of the Philippines, or so the biggest city in Luzon, the kind of largest island of the Philippines. There was a blockade of Cuba, but it started really in Manila, and after that is when the U.S. and McKinley started ordering troops, and there were naval battles around Cuba. So this is just a highlight of these are two major dates. That was the Battle of Manila Bay. There's a little tiny sort of portrait of Commodore George Dewey at the top of that picture. This was the War of 1898, excuse me, was a complete massacre. The Americans literally destroyed Spanish, Manila Bay especially, on the morning of May 1st, 1898. And as the war progressed, this was partly because the U.S. was just had better equipment, had better training. It was, I would say, though, it was in large part also that Spain, the disparity was so large. Spain had very outdated ships, guns. Their sort of naval leaders were fleeing U.S. admirals as they were engaged in naval battles. I mean, it was just a complete massacre. With maybe some and very minor exceptions. So after a couple of months, McKinley had actually offered a peace deal secretly in early June. Spain had spurned that, but in early August, it sort of said, okay, no, we should end this because of what was happening. So August 12th, took place in Washington D.C. There was a peace protocol. It was actually executed by the French. Spanish diplomats, of course, were no longer in D.C., and so the French did it on the Spanish behalf. I'm skipping a lot of detail about Spanish-American War and lead-ups. I'm sure you've heard some stories about the explosion of the Maine, and we can sort of get into that in Q&A and stuff. But I sort of want to get to this decision point of the Philippines. So once all this took place over the course of the summer, what happens then is there's an agreement that hostilities are suspended. And that there would be a peace treaty to take place in Paris. And I sort of want to emphasize how major of a war this was. And it was a small, short war, but it was America's first overseas war in many, many, many decades. This was not something the United States did very often in the 19th century, neither against foreign powers nor against, much less overseas. So this peace conference took place right after the war, from October to December 1898. Spain, as you saw earlier, Spain had all these colonial possessions. And so the United States demanded that Spain gives up a few of them. And so Spain reluctantly, ultimately kind of gave up Guam, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines. Cuba was given independence sort of nominally. The U.S. actually controlled it through military governorship for a few years before it turned into an informal protectorate, or formal protectorate in some ways, for many decades after that. The U.S. also paid $20 million to Spain for these sorts of relinquishing these territories. But it's really important to emphasize how that McKinley did not actually decide on annexing the Philippines. I mean, we talked about this decision point. He gets to October 28th. He finally decides to annex the Philippines. He was not planning on that before October 1898, late October 1898. McKinley had waffled a bit. He knew he wanted a naval base in the Philippines. We defeated Spain. All right, they thought, can we benefit from a naval base in Asia? but he really was not planning on annexing the whole thing. He went back and forth. He offered this secret deal to Spain in June as a peace deal, where he sort of said we would give up all of the Philippines, but maybe with the exception of maybe a naval base. He sent for this Paris Peace Commission conference. His lead commissioner was his closest foreign policy advisor, somebody who actually did not want and advise the president against full annexation. So McKinley was really not sure what he was going to do until kind of pretty late in the game, after the conference had really kicked off. I should also say, once this treaty was signed in mid-December, it had to pass the U.S. Senate, which it did, just barely. But McKinley really was the one behind the annexation. It was his decision. Nobody in Congress was really forcing him to do so. And so why? Why did McKinley, going back, why did McKinley annex this territory so 7,000 miles away from California? One of the most popular explanations is that he sort of saw it as a method to get to the China market, sort of, as they called it, the fabled China market. There were riches in the East, people would say, and McKinley wanted a piece of that, and he saw the Philippines as a way to get that. I'm not very convinced by that. McKinley actually wasn't. There were many foreign trade expansionists at the time. McKinley was not one of them, a fervent economic expansionist. He supported foreign trade, but he was not. That was not something. He also thought that actually foreign markets were more unpredictable than markets at home domestically. Nevertheless, Walter Lefebvre, one of the most famous historians, argues that, and has argued, many people have argued it since. Another argument is that religion mattered, that McKinley was this is an era of the missionary movements. McKinley himself was a Methodist and a religious man. That argument also, I think, has been debunked. And there was also there's another argument. I mean, I should say there are many arguments out there. Another very prominent argument is that McKinley really was so politically savvy. He kind of had a sense about the nation that that the public really wants me to annex the Philippines, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. That's sort of the argument that Ernest May, also another very prominent historian, made in 1961, and other people have made since. The two rationales that I've sort of found most convincing, although incomplete, but most convincing, are two arguments made, one very recently by Philip Zelikow, and one by a man named Ephraim Smith in 1985. And they basically say, I should say Zelikow's piece is probably the most detailed reconstruction of the Philippines decision out of anything I've ever read. They sort of say, McKinley was looking at the Philippines and he made a strategic decision. He believed that the United States, if it wanted this naval base, but if it left, it couldn't give the islands back to Spain because it went to war over Spanish colonialism and colonial control over Cuba. It couldn't just give them back to Spain. Giving them to another power would invite conflict with other powers because of imperial jealousies, and leaving them to themselves, independence, would also lead to chaos and war, because he believed that other imperial powers, in particular Japan and Germany, remember this is the moment in the 1890s to set the stage of his sort of background of his decision making, was that this was a moment of immense imperial expansion, especially in Asia and in Africa. But European countries were gobbling up Pacific ports and territories. And Japan, too, was a major player at this moment after the Sino-Japanese War a few years prior. So those were concerns. And so to avoid a world war in 1898, McKinley decided to annex the Philippines entirely, so there would not be this competition over them. I actually think that is what McKinley was thinking. I mean, this is something that you see in his the very few surviving documents of his thinking. Also, advisors, what his advisors are saying. There were a few very important advisors who came to the White House to advise McKinley on the Philippine situation. They were also making these sorts of points. He says that after the decision was made, this sort of strategic argument is really there quite in the archival material. Nevertheless, you sort of can't help but think, to me, a couple of questions: why he really thought chaos was had such a high probability. Why was he so sure that there was going to be chaos in the Philippines? And secondly, why did that matter? Going back to this map, if there was war in the Philippines, why should the United States care that much about it? The United States was not trading a lot with Asia at this point. We talked about the Asian market. The U.S. it was something like, depending on whether or not you talk about manufacturing materials, raw materials, it was maybe 1% with all of Asia. A couple of percent was all of U.S. trade with Asia was just a couple of percent of total U.S. trade, not the U.S. economy. And so, and total U.S. trade, or exports at least, were a very small proportion of the U.S. economy at that time. So trade with Asia was not only a small fraction of U.S. trade. U.S. trade was a small fraction of the economy. So, it's not like there was going to be a massive disruption in trade. It's not clear why that would be so important. I mean, maybe there would be the U.S. would care a little bit about such a war. They would want to protect its interests, protect the small amount of trade that was there, but certainly not an interest large enough to actually annex 9 million people 7,000 miles away. Right? That's a huge national interest. It should be a huge national interest if you're willing to do that. And at that stage, I don't think it was. Nevertheless, he did it. So why did that matter to him? So now we're sort of finally getting to my reasoning, or what I think why McKinley annexed the Philippines in 1898. I rely, as I've done this entire presentation, on previous research. There's these are actually the two pieces here are actually not specifically about the Philippines, not specifically about McKinley's annexation of the Philippines. Nevertheless, are very important for this argument. I think that McKinley, to some degree, so this was you see a very obviously very patronizing portrait of McKinley and a Filipino on the left. It was a magazine at the time. McKinley, much like many people at the time, had a sort of civilizational worldview that categorized peoples. This overlapped a little bit with race, overlapped with nations of origin. All these sort of terms were not entirely clear. Nevertheless, there was a lot of talk about civilization, and at the top were the civilized people like Americans, white Anglo-Saxons, British, etc. And at the bottom were savages and barbarians, of course. And so a lot of people felt that this was sort of a categorization of people around the world. McKinley certainly did himself, although he was actually a little more progressive with respect to race than many of his peers. And one element of that progressiveness, again, for his time, not by today's standards, was that he sort of thought there was a fluidity to this civilizational hierarchy, that you could sort of move up and down the civilizational ladder. And so he thought, the Filipinos really can't self-govern. There's going to be chaos because they're just, these various tribes that are fractious tribes. They don't have a unified leader. They can't self-govern. And that's the reason why there would be chaos. But you know what? If we're there, we can actually teach them how to do it. This was the sort of principles undergirding the phrase, you might have heard it, civilizational uplift. This was something that also overlapped quite a bit with religion. So to some extent, I should say, religion was maybe part of it, but it was, to me, through the channel of a civilizational idea. Now, why any of it mattered, and this really gets to stickiness. Why would that have mattered? There's a Richard Thaler, his 1980 piece, drawing on previous research on indecision science and economics. Theorizes this idea called the endowment effect. The endowment effect, it comes from another theory called prospect theory, which we can also talk about in Q&A. Prospect theory sort of was theorized by Dan Kahneman and Amos Tversky, two very, very famous decision scientists. You've heard of them. Dan Kahneman wrote a very famous book called Thinking Fast and Slow. That's very popular right now. Still very popular. Anyway, prospect theory is about how people, it's more complicated than this, but basically that people really don't like losing things. They're called loss averse. I mean, really don't like losing things. And don't like losing things as much as they like gaining actually the same thing. They just really disproportionately like, hate losing things. That's maybe one of the many findings of Amos Tversky and Dan Kahneman. The other part of it is that people have reference-dependent preferences, that reference points matter. So people, think there are many applications of reference dependence that you sort of say, you go to your favorite coffee shop and you always expect there to be a medium-sized line, and when there's a medium-sized line, actually doesn't bother you at all. But you go to your favorite restaurant and you always expect there to be no line. But when there's a medium-sized line, actually it bothers you quite a bit. Part of it is, some expectation that you have these reference points. That's a very crude example, but you see it all over in decision-making. It's a very, very prominent finding. In any event, Richard Thaler built on sort of reference-dependent preferences and prospect theory by saying, when you own something, you really value it more than you would have before you owned it. And not only that, you would value it more than something of equivalent value. So, your favorite, or not favorite, but you have a coffee mug or you have a hat or you have some piece of something, you tend to value it more than you would have otherwise, than you would have paid for it before you owned it. Sort of an odd thing. I mean, there's a debate in decision science as to what exactly drives it. It's a little more, is it ownership? Is it, as I mentioned, loss aversion from prospect theory? But nevertheless, people do hate parting with things that they own, that they possess. And that is, I took that theory, or when I was reading McKinley's, I'd learned that theory before, and when I was reading McKinley's statements, I couldn't help but think or realize that actually he wasn't framing this decision as one of gain. He was framing it as one of loss. So what's very curious about McKinley's Philippines decision is that he thought of the U.S. as already possessing it, and that's kind of crazy. I mean, the U.S., of course, in reality, the U.S. definitely did not control the Philippines and its 2,000 islands. Didn't even control the largest island, but it did defeat Spanish colonial rulers, and it did hold Manila. And when you look at McKinley's statements, because of those facts, he thought of the Philippines as a place of U.S. ownership, of a place of U.S. control. And he would use the words like possess, we cannot retreat, we cannot leave, we don't want to lose this thing, we don't want to haul our flag down. That's actually the image on the right is from a speech where he says, who will haul it down? And he didn't just do this for propaganda purposes to convince public, which, by the way, probably were convinced by that kind of framing. He actually used it in private, and he used it in private before he even knew he was going to make this decision. Once Commodore Dewey defeated the Spanish in Manila, the words like possession, control come up in internal documents, and almost I think I've ever seen the word gain come. Even though the U.S. was obviously going to gain the Philippines, they saw it as not a return to the status quo ante, but they saw it as a loss. And that is just such a significant mental framework. It has a huge effect on how we value things. And that is what leads us to, what does this have to do with psychology of stickiness? And what does it have to do with today? I think it's very easy and tempting to look back at McKinley's Philippines decision and say, you know what, that was a different time. There was colonialism. Of course, people had these crazy civilizational hierarchies. And of course, that's true. It was a different time. There were different attitudes. But I think writing that off is actually a great danger, because we lose the second half. the mundaneness, the very common element of the endowment effect. It's not something that just affects people in the past. And I should say, the endowment effect, Richard Thaler, who'd written about it, applied the endowment effect to, he was a decision scientist and economist. There have been other political scientists who have applied this to historical, not the endowment effect, but prospect theory, the kind of the thing that the endowment effect was sort of based off of, have applied that to decision making. Sometimes it's always hard to project something that's found through psych experiments to real world. But I think, to me, it sort of intuitively is confirmed, or intuitively is right and confirmed by the many statements that McKinley made at the time. And also this sort of feeling that, we do sort of overvalue things that we feel that we own. I think that's something that we can draw a very major lesson from. That it's not just, and I should, obviously these sorts of psychological biases obviously affect different people to different degrees. I should say that with the Afghanistan withdrawal, Biden obviously to some degree has escaped this more than others, to his credit. Of course, he still has the rest of his presidency, but he seems unlike many others who have taken the helm. They've sort of been able to look at it a bit more objectively. As to whether or not this staying was really critical. Not that it couldn't hold any benefit for the United States, obviously, that's why it's complicated, but whether or not it was the same national interest as it was 20 years ago when the US first got involved. The consequence of the endowment effect, in my opinion, is that we sort of inflate security threats. So once you value things more because you're there, because you own them, you sort of feel that there's a larger stake, that you sort of inflate security threats. You inflate, much like McKinley did with this possible chaos or European war, half a world away. And I think maybe the biggest, the craziest sort of finding of McKinley's decision, is that it shows that military presence can drive interest. It should be the other way around. Obviously, you have an interest, you send force, and so you have a military presence because of that. And obviously, McKinley initially did send force because there was an interest to neutralize the Spanish fleet. But it was the continuing presence that actually drove interest in Filipino affairs after the war was done. It's not just interest driving, and there's a risk there. The presence can inflate interest. I think another risk is that it sort of manipulates your sense of self. Reduces your appreciation of the many tools of statecraft that you have. Things like cybersecurity. Right now, sorts of economics is having such a moment in U.S. foreign policy with respect to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and also just diplomacy. I mean, I think those are less salient. So we think of military footprints as so much more salient, and that increases our sort of valuation, I think, of those sorts of tools of diplomacy at the expense of others. And I think you really need this awareness when debating national interests. Of course, there's a lot of people debate, this place is important to us, or this place. But I think one of the things that's lost in those debates is the general feeling that we inflate threats because of this sort of stickiness, this endowment effect, this feeling that we have some amount of ownership, either ownership of problems or ownership of people, ownership of places, things, military installations, bases, etc. Of course, it's not to say that there weren't ever reasons for those things and people to be there. And it's not that there are never reasons, of course, to deploy force, but you want to deploy force when it's really important, when it's really vital to national interests. And so I think that this is something that skews that calculation. So I will stop there. Thank you so much for bearing with me this whole time. Of course, I'll stop sharing now. See if there are any other,
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. And to our audience, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature in the toolbox. I will start off with a question that was sent in actually before the event in terms of kind of just modern relevancy. What does the psychology of stickiness suggest will happen with the Russian intervention in Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always very dangerous for people to opine on any stage of conflict, but early stages of conflict. I think the psychology of stickiness, I think the endowment effect actually has something quite a bit to say about U.S. force posture in Europe, which is to say that the U.S. has sort of inflated the security threat. And obviously it's being, with Russia's invasion, of course, that is challenged. And I think, I think a major question for Biden, U.S. national security apparatus, is balancing what is, and I actually think Biden has escaped this mental trap more than many other leaders, which is why I think we're sort of seeing him not commit U.S. troops. He sort of does not see that in U.S. national interest, not just because it's Ukraine. I mean, it's partly Ukraine, and then partly also it's avoiding a nuclear war with Russia, which is a major thing to avoid. Obviously, that would be horrible. So I think, it sort of suggests that we're inflating threats in Europe, but I kind of think that we're avoiding that at the moment. I think Biden is sort of trying to thread this needle of, okay, we have alliance commitments, even if he won't maybe say this publicly, but even if there are countries, there is a hierarchy of NATO countries that matter to the United States. The alliance is very important, so we won't distinguish. And of course, the alliance constitution doesn't distinguish. An attack on one is an attack on all. So, but I think for the moment, Biden is sort of able to. He's been able to avoid this kind of trap, and you can sort of see that by him sort of using these, as I said, these less salient tools of statecraft. Biden, I think, has promoted those tools of statecraft. It's not that any previous presidents have not, but I would say he's given it quite a bit more prominence in his decision making.
Yeah, and I do think that maybe that there's brings up an interesting question that I might have is how much does kind of the endowment effect carry over into our alliances, and is there any risk that the endowment effect can kind of have alliances overstay their welcome, I guess, just oversimplify it? Yeah.
I mean, I think that's exactly right. But it's very hard. I mean, obviously, then the endowment effect comes up against the realities of institutional governance, and institutional governance is very sticky. Things that, what the rationales for certain organizations, certain groupings, and alliances in in world history, I mean, they don't last forever. They break up at some point. It's hard to kind of imagine that world right now. And why do they, stay together so long? I guess you could sort of apply this to a relationship too, to some degree. The phrases I'm using. I think that is true. I think that's right. That doesn't mean, I'm not advocating for the breakup of NATO, but I do think that there is an element that there is an argument that that the original threat levels, the threat from Russia today, even with the invasion of Ukraine, I don't, at least not now. This could change, but today I don't think it's quite, where it was in the 40s and 50s. It doesn't feel that intuitively to me. Again, we'll see how this develops, but I think that's part of it.
Absolutely. A question that I had chatted to me, I remember using Q&A here, is do you believe that the endowment effect can help explain kind of bureaucratic politics? For example, many supervisors in the federal government are very hesitant to lose their budget and people under them. Also, they gain status among peers by having a higher budget and more people under them.
Yeah, all these, even with respect to the Philippines annexation, of course, there are many, many factors that go into all these sorts of things. I don't think I would say it's the endowment effect. Maybe it's. I think I would probably say it's the reference-dependent preferences. This is also very common in negotiation. Sort of negotiate to create a reference point, and so it's easier, even if it's a little crazy. You're able to, once you kind of stake a sort of position, you're able to be closer to that than you otherwise would be. So if I were to say, John, here's I haven't seen a gumball machine in in a pizza place in 20 or 25 years, but let's just
I don't know if I'd want to eat the gum in there.
There's a gumball machine, and sort of have like, guess how many gumballs are in the gumball machine.
Mm-hmm.
And the person in front of you says 300. Social science experience would say when John makes his guess, if you're behind the person who says 300, you hear the word 300, you're more likely to suggest a number that's closer to 300 than if that person wasn't there and you were to go solo and make your own. Maybe you would say something, maybe you would say 150, or maybe you would say something much, much larger, depending on what you thought about how many gumballs were in the gumball machine. But these are reference to meta preferences. So I think that budgets to some degree, are part of that. Now I think about it, could be the endowment effect, something that you own. It could be. I think there are a lot of psychological biases that are playing in this. As you said, there's also status, which is a whole different kind of world of, psychology.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think something that I kept kind of thinking back to in my own head is, I don't know if you're familiar at all with Professor Chris Fettweiss at Tulane University, but he wrote the book Psychology of a Superpower, and has a lot of similar points that you do, that we kind of have this threat inflation as a superpower that others maybe don't perceive. Yeah. But one thing that he does bring up early in his book is the kind of discussion of, can you actually use psychology to analyze kind of great power politics, international relations. And I guess, I think you can. I think you'd probably agree with that. But what are maybe some weaknesses in using kind of psychology to kind of try to analyze strategy in IR? Yeah,
it's a great question. And
I guess maybe.
Yep. As you can probably, sorry, after you.
Yeah, I was just going to say maybe a good way to kind of bring this back into the endowment effect is, how can we tell if the endowment effect is the critical factor, or if there's other kind of mechanisms at work?
Yeah, in all likelihood, there are other mechanisms at work. I think there. With respect to McKinley, I spent many years studying him. I really think that it's a very important factor. Though even in this presentation, of course, it's not everything. There are other things involved with that decision. To your point about psych and IR, I actually think that that's one of the most exciting areas of research in international relations today. It has been for some time. There were some real pioneers in the 90s, but I think it's experiencing a golden era right now. That said, there certainly are weaknesses in doing that. One major weakness is, of course, everyone experiences psychological. Psychology is much more than just biases, of course, and biases are a big part of it, but there's much more to it than that. We still don't really understand group decision making. So that when you prioritize what we do know in psychology and in psych decision making, you might be underplaying a lot of other findings that cut against it or that are different. You also, social science, applying social science to the real world or history is always is difficult because what you're taking are essentially lab experiments, as in psych experiments, and taking those findings and translating them to real world situations. And so I think that is always going to be difficult to do. It's not that it's impossible, and it's not that it doesn't yield good, valuable findings. But I that's certainly is a difficulty.
Absolutely. Daniel asked a great question. I think he asked, does it always take a major event like the Spanish-American War or World War II to create these sticky institutions, or can they come about unconsciously?
Yeah. So, major, I would say the Spanish-American War, which I do think was very major, I don't think was quite as, of course, was in the world of wars was led to huge, major consequences. World War II, of course, spawned a whole number of institutions that the War of 1898 did not. So to that extent, of course, those were different. But in degree. But no, I don't think so. I don't see why it would need to be a major war. It's not that, deployment of U.S. military personnel is not all there's a high concentration in Korea and Japan and Germany, and, Europe, of course, because of those because of the wars. But that's not it. And there are, of course, other installations elsewhere. I think one difference here is, and you said institutions, and I think that's, people talk about the stickiness of institutions. These are sort of related. The idea that like institutions are sticky, they like, once their mandate ends, they kind of stick around, right? To some extent, I think that overlaps to a degree with what I've been talking about. My intuition was more about, when you arrive at a place and you feel like you own something, less so like, have we created in an intergovernmental organization, we have an institution. I think there's a lot of overlapping intuitions, but I do just sort of want to very briefly draw that distinction.
So yeah, I think that maybe leads to another question of maybe the generational kind of effects of, the stickiness of kind of the endowment effect. Do you and maybe this overflows from the cup of psychology into sociology, but through your research, have you kind of noticed kind of how long that endowment effect sticks around through generations? Is it a case that through generations, people become more stuck on kind of that endowment effect, or do you see it kind of loosening its grip as generations come?
It's very hard to say. I think it's an excellent thought. Somebody should study it. Frankly, I don't know that power. And I'm sure it depends on the situation, depends on the person. Of course, in many ways, the opposite argument, sort of people make arguments generationally that, once a generation passes, the next generation doesn't remember, this point is made obviously often about the Holocaust, especially with the rise in anti-Semitic attacks in the United States. And so that's not the endowment effect, but to some degree that's about historical memory and reference points. And, if you have a reference point or you haven't experienced something or you haven't seen it, then you're less likely to have that as a reference point. That intuitively feels right to me. I don't think I could really wager a guess on how many years that could take. But, obviously these things do recede in historical memory. They're not permanent by any means.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess maybe kind of getting into kind of our last couple questions of the night. I guess maybe this kind of goes back to the debates we all have in our IR 101 class about rationality within international politics. Do you think that we should see states broadly as rational actors given psychological factors in play?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the most difficult questions in IR theory. It's very interesting to me is a lot of the commentary on Putin right now, and people saying, well, if he was really rational, he really would have just gone for that eastern slice of Ukraine, wouldn't have really done the full-on attack as he did. And he's just sitting, by himself with the COVID pandemic, not paying attention. And so, not to mention people who are trying to understand how Donald Trump made decision-making and other people always go to psychological elements. And yet, for a lot of IR theorists, when we look back in history, we sort of say, we sort of discount some of those things. But when we try to explain today's world, we're always grasping at those hints. So that to me indicates that psychology is undervalued. I could definitely do not think it is the only thing. I think there is a huge amount of rationalism involved in state decision-making. I mean, even in Putin's case, of course, there is some logic that he's following, maybe less so now than at certain other points in his career. Twisted logic, things we may not agree with, things we might think are bad for the world. Nevertheless, sort of strategic calculation involved. So it's not that, I think that is a false choice. I guess where I ended up, I sort of think of it as, you really need both of those elements. Even McKinley there was, I don't know, call it rationalism, there's sort of a version. It had strategic logic. Annexing the Philippines sort of said, well, this happens, this happens, this happens, this happens. There was a strategic sort of forecast involved. I don't think it was entirely, an objective appraisal of U.S. national interests. And so I think that's why you sort of need both of those elements to really make a good judgment on historical decision-making.
Absolutely. Real quick question here from Steve, to kind of build on John's my former question about stickiness over time. In the Cold War, Truman's critics says he lost China, which of course the U.S. never controlled.
Yeah.
So how do you measure who decides when something is quote unquote owned, leaders or public, and how does that play into the advocacy for restraint in foreign policy? So a little bit of a big question here towards the end.
Yeah, and it comes sort of a double question. Yeah, and I mean, look, the U.S. also didn't own, the Philippines. Well, you really, I think it's best to really constrain what you're talking about in this sort of presentation. I was really talking about McKinley's decision. It is hard for me to say without going through the papers of a lot of other people, because a lot of people did advocate against controlling the Philippines. They just weren't. They just weren't president, so they weren't making the choice. So I think who decides it. Well, everybody decides it in their own internal heads, but not everybody matters to the same extent in U.S. foreign policy, right? I mean, you have to. It's not only the leaders that matter, but they ultimately make the decision. So you have to sort of filter everything through their brains in how they see the world. And there was a second part of your question, I've forgotten it.
How does how does that play into advocacy for restraint in foreign policy?
Yeah, I mean, when you see, I think it's an analysis of language. To some degree, there's a little bit of propaganda here. Of course, retreat. Nobody wants to be seen as retreating. So that is, it's that you some degree have to sort of differentiate that, or at least make sure you're aware that it's not all necessarily reflective of how something's conceptualized. Nevertheless, when you're seeing the certain words own, control, possess, and when you have installations about physical territory, or structures and people there, it's not just like something entirely baked in the mind or imagined. There is actually really material there. And people are sort of referring to, this is sort of the case with McKinley. It was like, it was trying to understand how he was conceptualizing it based on the words he was saying. And so I think that's sort of a way to get at, I think what you're saying is you sort of need to, and I should say there's another element of this was, I think, a very effective way to think about, to make sure to check yourself is to think, what would I do in the counterfactual? If we were not there, or if we didn't have anything there, how would we be talking about this, and how would we list our national interests? And I think that's a very, very good way of kind of having an internal correction mechanism to sort of check yourself to think, okay, am I sort of disproportionately skewing the national interest at stake?
Absolutely. Well, we're about out of time here. I'm going to go ahead and put a link in the chat for everyone here to join us for our event next Wednesday, Military Effectiveness in Ukraine and Beyond, with Professor Jason Castillo from Texas A&M's Bush School. But this was absolutely fantastic. I always love hearing about the psychology involved in IR. So thank you so much, Aroop, for joining us here tonight. And I hope that we have the opportunity to talk again. But thank you all for coming out here tonight. And thank you to our speaker, as always, for a very interesting conversation.
Thank you so much, John.
Absolutely. Have a great night, everyone.